Sarah Beaumont wiped sweat from her brow as she carefully lifted the stack of deteriorating cardboard boxes. The basement of the Louisiana Historical Society building was sweltering despite the autumn chill that had settled over New Orleans. The air conditioning had broken 3 days ago, and the repair crew wouldn't arrive until next week. Still, the work couldn't wait. "Find anything interesting?" Marcus called from across the room. Her colleague was elbow-deep in his own set of artifacts, cataloguing daguerreotypes from the 1840s. "Just more water damage," Sarah replied, sighing as she examined the damp corners of yet another box. "I swear, if we don't get proper climate control down here soon, we're going to lose half the collection." At 32, Sarah had already established herself as one of the most meticulous archivists in the city. Her specialty was photographic preservation, particularly from the Civil War era. The Historical Society had hired her 6 months ago to help digitize their extensive collection, much of which had never been properly catalogued. She set the box on the examination table and carefully lifted the lid, revealing several glass plate negatives nestled in deteriorating velvet. The plates were larger than she expected, likely from a view camera used in the mid-19th century. "Marcus, come look at these," she called, slipping on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves before gently lifting one of the plates. "I think these might be pre-Civil War." Marcus joined her, adjusting his glasses as he leaned in to examine the negative. "Definitely. Look at the edges. Hand-cut glass. That's consistent with the 1850s, before standardized sizes became common." Sarah held the negative up to the light, squinting to make out the image. "It's some kind of interior shot. A parlor, maybe." She carefully placed it on the light table and switched it on. The image revealed itself, a formal Victorian parlor with heavy drapes, ornate furniture, and at the center a small coffin on a draped table. Beside it stood a young girl of perhaps 7 or 8, her face solemn and pale in the long exposure. "A memorial photograph," Sarah murmured. Post-mortem photography was common then. Families often wanted a final image to remember their loved ones. Marcus frowned. But usually the deceased was the subject. Why photograph the coffin with a living child? Sarah studied the image more closely. Wait, look at the child's face. The girl's features were unnaturally still, her eyes fixed and glassy, her posture too rigid. "She's not alive, Marcus. They've posed her beside the coffin of someone else. Probably a parent or sibling." Sarah's voice dropped. This was common practice, using stands and pins to pose the deceased as if they were still alive. "Jesus," Marcus whispered. "That's unsettling." Sarah carefully placed the negative back in its velvet nest and examined the others. 5 more plates, each showing similar scenes, Victorian mourning rituals, carefully posed deceased subjects, one particularly haunting image of twin boys propped in chairs, their eyes painted onto their closed lids in a disturbing attempt at lifelikeliness. At the bottom of the box lay a small leather journal, its pages warped from humidity. Sarah opened it carefully, revealing faded brown ink in an elegant script. "It's dated 1859, she said, scanning the first page. "Belongs to someone named Thomas Guillot. He appears to have been a photographer in the Garden District." Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon photographing the negatives and beginning the preservation process. By the time she locked up the archive at 7 p.m., the journal and one of the glass negatives, the one with the girl, were safely stored in archival materials on her desk, ready for further examination tomorrow. The streetlights cast long shadows as Sarah walked to her apartment in the Marigny district. The air was thick with humidity, despite the October date, carrying the faint scent of the Mississippi River and night-blooming jasmine. Her mind kept returning to the little girl in the photograph, the careful positioning of her small body, the vacant stare, the uncomfortable knowledge that someone had manipulated her corpse for the camera. Sarah's apartment was on the 2nd floor of a converted 1890s house, with high ceilings and original hardwood floors that creaked with every step. She dropped her bag by the door and headed straight for the shower, as if the hot water could wash away the disquieting thoughts that had followed her home. Later, as she lay in bed, the ceiling fan spinning lazily above her, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. The girl's face kept appearing in her mind, those fixed, lifeless eyes somehow seeming to look directly at her through time. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Marcus. "Check your email. Found something on our photographer." Sarah reached for her laptop and opened her inbox. Marcus had sent a link to an old newspaper article from 1860, "Tragic end to prominent photographer Thomas Guillot, 42, was found dead yesterday in his Garden District studio, the apparent victim of mercury poisoning common to daguerreotypists." Mr. Guillot was known for his memorial portraits and was survived by no family. His collection of photographic equipment and plates will be auctioned next month. Sarah frowned. Mercury poisoning wasn't uncommon among early photographers, who often suffered from prolonged exposure to the chemicals used in their craft. But something about the article felt off, the abruptness, the lack of detail. She closed her laptop and finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with Victorian parlours and the sensation of being watched by unblinking eyes. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the archive early, determined to learn more about Thomas Guillot and his photographs. She carefully opened his journal, photographing each page before attempting to read the faded script. The early entries were mundane: records of clients, chemical formulas for developing solutions, notes on lighting and exposure times. But as she progressed through the journal, the entries became more erratic. May 15th, 1859, another child today. The Boudreau girl, only 8 years old, yellow fever. The mother insisted I capture her as if in peaceful slumber. I positioned her beside her doll collection. The new armature worked well for maintaining posture, though the mother wept when she saw the pins. They always do. They want the comfort of the image, but cannot bear the reality of its creation. Sarah felt a chill despite the basement's warmth. She continued reading, the entries growing increasingly disturbing. June 3rd, 1859. I see them now when I close my eyes. All the faces, all the children, standing around my bed at night, silent, watching. Dr. Marchand has prescribed laudanum for my nerves, but it only makes the visions more vivid. July 20th, 1859. The Devereux twins today, both taken by scarlet fever within hours of each other. Their father insisted I open their eyes for the photograph. When I could not, he demanded I paint eyes upon their lids. The result was most unsettling. I fear I shall see those false eyes in my dreams tonight. The final entry, dated September 8, 1859, was barely legible, the handwriting erratic and pressed hard into the paper. They are not dead when I photograph them. I see them breathe. I see them move when the plate is exposed. Only in that moment between worlds, only I can see it. The parents never notice, but the children know I see them. That's why they visit me now. That's why they stand around my bed. That's why they whisper. They know I saw them in that moment when they were neither living nor dead, and now I belong to them. Sarah closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. Photographers of that era often worked with the dead, and the psychological toll must have been immense. Guillot had clearly suffered from delusions, perhaps exacerbated by mercury poisoning. She turned her attention to the glass negative from yesterday. Under proper archival conditions, she began the process of creating a contact print that would show the image as it was meant to be seen, rather than the inverted appearance of the negative. As the image developed in the chemical bath, Sarah leaned forward, studying the details that emerged. The girl's face became clearer, the vacant eyes, the unnatural stillness of her posture. But there was something else, something she hadn't noticed in the negative. In the background, reflected in a mirror on the parlor wall, was a figure, a man, presumably the photographer, Guillot himself, standing behind his camera. But his face was turned toward the camera, not looking through it as he should have been during exposure. And his expression, Even in the small reflection, Sarah could see it was a mask of terror. Why would he look so frightened while photographing a deceased child? And how had he triggered the camera while standing away from it? As Sarah pondered these questions, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The girl's hand, which had appeared naturally positioned in the negative, now showed a subtle blur in the print, the only blur in an otherwise sharp image. Movement. During the long exposure time, that hand had moved. The realization that there might be movement in the photograph sent Sarah into a research frenzy. She knew that early photography required subjects to remain perfectly still for exposures that could last several minutes. Any movement would appear as a blur. The fact that only the girl's hand showed this effect while the rest of the image remained crisp was profoundly disturbing. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Marcus commented when he found her surrounded by books on 19th century photography and Victorian mourning practices. "I'm not sure I haven't," Sarah replied, pushing the contact print toward him. "Look at the girl's right hand, and then look at the mirror in the background." Marcus studied the image, his expression shifting from curiosity to unease. "That's unusual, but there could be rational explanations. Maybe the body shifted during exposure, settling, or some kind of post-mortem movement. Gas release can sometimes cause movement hours after death." After rigor mortis had set in, unlikely. Sarah ran a hand through her hair. "And what about Guillot's reflection? Why does he look terrified? Could be a flaw in the negative. Or maybe he was just anxious about capturing a good image for the grieving family." Marcus didn't sound convinced by his own explanation. Sarah shook her head. "I need to find out more about him. And about this girl." She spent the afternoon searching through the Historical Society's records and online databases of New Orleans newspapers from the period. Thomas Guillot had been moderately well known in his time, advertising his memorial portraiture services in the local papers. Several articles mentioned his skill at creating most lifelike remembrances of departed loved ones. An obituary from October 1859 provided more details than the brief article Marcus had found. The funeral of Mr. Thomas Guillot, held yesterday at St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, was attended by several prominent Garden District families who had employed his photographic services. Mr. Guillot, who was found deceased in his studio last week, had become known for his sensitive portrayal of the departed, particularly children lost to the recent yellow fever outbreak. The coroner determined the cause of death to be mercury poisoning, a common occupational hazard for daguerreotypists. However, colleagues noted that Mr. Guillot had been suffering from nervous exhaustion in recent months, claiming to experience disturbing hallucinations and insomnia. Another small article, dated 2 weeks after Guillot's death, caught Sarah's attention. Vandalism at cemetery. The recently interred remains of photographer Thomas Guillot were disturbed last night when his tomb was broken into. Cemetery caretakers report that the corpse appeared to have been arranged in a seated position facing the entrance of the tomb. Authorities suspect the involvement of practitioners of the voodoo arts, though no evidence was left at the scene. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. Someone had posed Guillot's corpse just as he had posed so many others in life. Identifying the girl in the photograph proved more challenging. Without a name or specific date, Sarah had to comb through death records from 1859 looking for girls around the right age. Yellow fever had claimed many children that year, and the records were incomplete. By 5 p.m., her eyes were strained from reading microfilm, and she had a list of 12 possibilities. Girls between 6 and 10 years old who had died in New Orleans between May and September 1859. "I'm heading out," Marcus said, stopping by her desk. "You should too. You look exhausted." "I will soon," Sarah promised, though they both knew she would stay until the archive closed. After Marcus left, Sarah returned to the glass negatives. She carefully examined each one, creating contact prints and scrutinizing them for anomalies. In 3 of the 6 images, she found similar inconsistencies, subtle blurs suggesting movement, reflected expressions of fear or confusion on Guillaume's face. The most disturbing was the photograph of the twin boys. In the print, one boy's hand clearly gripped the other's arm, a detail impossible to create post-mortem and invisible in the negative until properly developed. At 8 p.m., the security guard knocked on the archive door. "Miss Beaumont, we need to lock up now." Sarah gathered her notes and the prints she'd made, securing the original negatives and journal in the climate-controlled storage cabinet. She'd gotten special permission to take digital copies home to continue her research. The night air was unusually cool as she walked home, a welcome relief after the stifling archive. October in New Orleans could still feel like summer, but tonight carried the first real hint of autumn. The streets of the Marigny were alive with music spilling from bars and restaurants, but Sarah barely noticed, her mind occupied with dead children and their photographer. In her apartment, she spread her research across the dining table and opened a bottle of wine. The unease that had been building all day settled around her like a fog. What had Guillaume seen through his camera? What had driven him to believe the dead children moved, breathed, existed in some liminal state captured only by his photographic plates? Sarah opened her laptop and began searching for more information about post-mortem photography and the belief systems of 19th-century New Orleans. The city had always been a melting pot of spiritual traditions, Catholic, voodoo, and various folk beliefs, all coexisting and sometimes blending. She found several accounts of photographers who claimed their cameras could capture spirits or auras invisible to the naked eye. In the Victorian era, when mortality rates were high and spiritualism was gaining popularity, many believed photography could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. One article particularly caught her attention: the threshold theory, photography as a portal between worlds. Written in 1897 by a Dr. Elias Merritt, it proposed that the chemical process of photography, combined with the moment of capturing a recently deceased subject, could create a temporary doorway between life and death. The soul, in its journey from the mortal coil, may linger in proximity to its earthly vessel, Merritt wrote. The photographic process, with its silver nitrate, its iodine, its mercury vapor, creates conditions under which this departing essence might be temporarily fixed, neither fully here nor fully gone. The camera becomes, in effect, a door left ajar between worlds. Sarah sipped her wine, considering the theory. It was pseudoscience, of course, the kind of mystical thinking that flourished in an era when death was commonplace and science was still developing. But something about it resonated with Guillaume's increasingly paranoid journal entries. Her phone rang, startling her. It was Marcus. "Sarah, are you still up? I found something you need to see." "What is it?" she asked, hearing the tension in his voice. "I was doing some digging into property records, trying to locate Guillaume's studio. It was on Prytania Street in the Garden District." And the building is still there. It's been divided into apartments now, but the original structure remains. And guess what the address is? Sarah waited, a sense of foreboding growing. "It's your building, Sarah. Your apartment is in Guillaume's former studio." The wineglass slipped from Sarah's hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. She looked around her apartment with new eyes, the high ceilings that would have allowed for natural light, the north-facing windows ideal for a photographer's studio. That's impossible," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't. New Orleans was full of repurposed historic buildings. It was entirely possible she was living in the space where Thomas Guillaume had created his disturbing memento mori, where he had arranged dead children to look alive, where he had gradually lost his mind. "There's more," Marcus continued. "I found a newspaper account from 1860, after Guillaume's death. The family that moved into the building afterward reported strange phenomena. Cold spots, unexplained noises, and their children complaining about the quiet children who stand in the corners at night. Sarah's gaze darted to the corners of her living room, suddenly appearing darker than they had moments before. The family moved out after 3 months, Marcus finished. The building remained vacant for nearly 2 years afterward. After hanging up, Sarah couldn't bring herself to go to bed. She paced the apartment, examining the walls and moldings with new awareness. Had Guillot died in this very room? Had he arranged those children's bodies here, manipulating their limbs and painting their faces to create the illusion of life? Near midnight, exhaustion finally overcame her unease. She collapsed into bed without changing her clothes, falling into a heavy sleep filled with fragmented dreams. In her dream, she stood in her apartment, but it was transformed. The walls bare plaster, the furniture replaced with Victorian pieces, heavy drapes blocking the windows. A large view camera stood on a tripod in the center of the room, its lens like a dark, watching eye. Children stood silently against the walls, dozens of them in formal Victorian dress, their faces pale and eyes unnaturally bright. They didn't speak or move, just watched her with unwavering gazes. Behind the camera stood a man she somehow knew was Thomas Guillot, tall and thin, with a photographer's stained hands and hollow eyes. "They come through when the plate is exposed," he said, his voice like dry leaves rustling. "That moment between light and dark, between here and not here, they step through." He gestured for Sarah to look through the camera. As she approached, the children began to whisper, a rising susurration of small voices that she couldn't quite make out. She bent to the viewfinder, and through it she saw not her apartment, but a grey, misty landscape where the children moved freely, reaching toward the camera, toward her, their faces transforming from placid masks to expressions of yearning and hunger. "They want to come back," Guillot whispered, now right beside her. "They always want to come back, and the camera lets them just for a moment. But a moment can be enough if they find someone to hold on to." Sarah jerked awake, her heart pounding. The bedroom was dark except for the glow of her phone, showing 3:17 a.m. Outside, rain had begun to fall, pattering against the windows. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Sarah became aware of a sound, faint but distinct. Footsteps, light and quick, moving across the living room floor. Children's footsteps. Sarah lay frozen in bed, listening to the soft patter of small feet moving across her living room floor. Her rational mind offered explanations: the building settling, rain on the roof, neighbors moving around upstairs, but none of them aligned with what she was hearing. The distinct sound of children walking, stopping, walking again. Gathering her courage, she reached for her phone and turned on its flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness as she slipped out of bed and moved cautiously toward her bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar. The footsteps stopped. Sarah pushed the door open wider, sweeping the light across her living room. Empty. The dining table still covered with her research materials, the broken wine glass still on the floor where she'd dropped it. She checked every corner, the bathroom, even the closets. Nothing. No one. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the windows. Sarah's heartbeat gradually slowed as the rational part of her brain reasserted control. Old buildings made noises. The wine and her research into Guillot had fed her imagination, creating the perfect conditions for auditory hallucinations. She cleaned up the broken glass, then made herself a cup of tea, knowing sleep wouldn't return easily. As the water boiled, she found herself drawn back to the dining table and her scattered research. Among the papers was the contact print of the girl beside the coffin, the first image she'd discovered. Sarah studied it again, noting the subtle blur of movement in the girl's hand, the frightened reflection of Guillot in the background mirror. Something about the mirror caught her attention. She hadn't noticed before, but it appeared to be an ornate standing mirror with a distinctive carved frame, flowers and vines intertwined with what looked like small faces. Sarah felt a jolt of recognition. She'd seen that mirror before. Moving to her landlord's storage closet at the end of the hall, the one he'd said contained building junk she was welcome to use, Sarah found the key on top of the door frame where she'd left it. Inside, among old paint cans and broken furniture, stood a tall object covered with a dusty sheet. With trembling hands, she pulled the sheet away, revealing an ornate Victorian mirror, the same one from the photograph. The same mirror that had once reflected Thomas Guillot's terrified face as he photographed a dead child who somehow moved. Sarah stared at her own reflection, pale and wide-eyed in the dim light. Behind her, the empty apartment stretched into shadow. Except, was it empty? In the mirror, just at the edge of visibility, she thought she saw movement, a small figure shifting in the darkness behind her. Sarah spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing. When she looked back at the mirror, whatever she'd glimpsed was gone. She backed out of the storage closet, locking it firmly. Sleep was now entirely out of the question. Instead, she returned to her research, determined to understand what was happening. By morning, she had formed a theory. If Guillot's journal and the photographic evidence were to be believed, something unusual had occurred during his post-mortem photography sessions. The chemical processes, combined with the liminal state of the recently deceased children, had created some kind of doorway, a thinning of the barrier between life and death. Guillot had inadvertently captured this phenomenon, and it had driven him to madness and eventually death. And now, by bringing his negatives out of storage and creating new prints from them, had Sarah somehow reopened that doorway. She arrived at the archive as soon as it opened, finding Marcus already there. "You look terrible," he said as she dropped her bag on the desk. "Rough night." "You have no idea," Sarah replied, pouring herself coffee from the pot Marcus had already brewed. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not think I'm crazy." She recounted everything, the footsteps in the night, finding the mirror from the photograph, her theory about Guillot's process somehow thinning the veil between worlds. To his credit, Marcus listened without interruption, his expression serious. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I don't think you're crazy," he finally said, "but I do think you're exhausted and deeply immersed in some disturbing historical material. That combination can play tricks on the mind. So you think I imagined the footsteps? The figure in the mirror? I think perception is subjective, especially when we're tired, stressed, and surrounded by suggestive material." Marcus squeezed her shoulder gently. "But I also think we should be thorough researchers and explore all possibilities. If there's something unusual about Guillot's photographic process, we should be able to find evidence in his work and records." They spent the day meticulously examining Guillot's journal and photographs alongside historical records of photographic techniques from the period. They discovered that Guillot had indeed used unusual chemical compounds in his developing process, additions of silver chloride and certain herbs that weren't standard for the time. "Some of these ingredients are associated with voodoo practices," Marcus noted, reading from a book on New Orleans folk magic. "They're believed to facilitate communication with the spirits of the dead." By late afternoon, they had developed a clearer picture of Thomas Guillot. Born in France, he had studied both photography and chemistry before immigrating to New Orleans in 1853. His early work focused on portraits of the living, but after the yellow fever epidemic of 1858, he began specializing in memorial photography, particularly of children. "Listen to this," Sarah said, reading from a letter they'd found in the archives, written by one of Guillot's assistants to a friend. "Mr. Guillot becomes more eccentric by the day. He insists on using his special developing solution, though it costs more and smells abominably. He spends hours alone with the subjects before I am permitted to enter the studio, and afterwards appears drained and distracted. Yesterday, I observed him speaking to an empty chair, as if someone were seated there. When I inquired, he insisted he was merely rehearsing instructions for tomorrow's sitting, though none was scheduled. As closing time approached, Sarah felt no closer to understanding what was happening in her apartment. The historical record confirmed that Guillot had been unstable and used unusual techniques, but provided no definitive evidence of supernatural phenomena. "Come stay at my place tonight," Marcus offered as they packed up. "You need rest, and a change of scene might help clear your head." Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. "Thanks, but I need to face this, whatever it is, in my own space. I'll be fine." She attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "At least let me come check the apartment with you," Marcus insisted. "We'll make sure there's no one hiding in your closets, and then I'll leave you to get some sleep." They walked to her building together as dusk settled over the city. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the streetlights. As they climbed the stairs to her second-floor apartment, Sarah felt a growing sense of dread, as if something waited for them above. Her key stuck in the lock, requiring several attempts before the door swung open. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Research spread across the dining table, empty teacup in the sink, bed unmade. Marcus checked each room thoroughly, opening closets and looking under furniture. "All clear," he reported. "No ghostly children or century-old photographers hiding anywhere." Sarah managed a genuine laugh this time. "Thanks. I know it sounds ridiculous in the daylight." "They're not ridiculous," Marcus corrected, "just inconclusive. We'll keep researching tomorrow. Maybe we'll find something that explains everything." After Marcus left, Sarah cleaned up her research materials and took a long, hot shower, letting the water wash away some of the tension she'd been carrying. The apartment felt peaceful now, the strange events of the night before seeming more distant and dreamlike. She made a simple dinner and watched a mindless comedy on her laptop, deliberately avoiding anything related to her research. By 11, she was yawning, her body demanding the sleep she'd missed the night before. The bedroom was cool and quiet as she slipped under the covers, leaving a small lamp on beside the bed. Despite her earlier unease, exhaustion quickly pulled her toward sleep. She was drifting on the edge of consciousness when she heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper coming from somewhere in the apartment. "Help us!" Sarah's eyes snapped open, fully alert now. She lay still, listening intently. "Stuck here." The voice was small, childlike, and seemed to come from the living room. Sarah sat up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "He won't let us go." Summoning all her courage, Sarah got out of bed and moved toward the bedroom door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice surprisingly steady. Silence. She pushed the door open wider and stepped into the living room. Empty, as expected, but the air felt different, heavier, colder, especially near the storage closet that contained the mirror. A soft scratching sound came from behind the closet door, like small fingernails dragging across wood. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, addressing the empty room, feeling both terrified and ridiculous. The scratching stopped, then so faintly she almost missed it. "To go home." Sarah pressed her hand against the closet door, feeling a deep cold radiating through the wood. "Who won't let you go?" she whispered. The answer came not as a voice, but as a sudden understanding that filled her mind. Guillot. The photographer had somehow bound these children to himself, to this place, through his photographic process. His own death had trapped them in a liminal state, unable to fully pass on. Sarah stepped back from the door, her mind racing. If her theory was correct, if Guillot's photographs had indeed created some kind of doorway, then perhaps the solution lay in the photographs themselves. She returned to the bedroom and grabbed her phone, quickly dialing Marcus despite the late hour. "I need you to bring Guillot's negatives and journal to my apartment," she said when he answered groggily. "Now, please. I think I know what's happening." To his credit, Marcus didn't argue. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't do anything until I arrive." While waiting, Sarah gathered everything she knew about Guillot and his techniques. His special chemical solution, the positioning of subjects, the specific camera he used, all might be components of whatever process had created this situation. When Marcus arrived, bleary-eyed but carrying a secure archive box containing the negatives and journal, Sarah had already cleared the dining table and covered it with a white cloth. We need to understand exactly what Guillaume did, she explained, carefully laying out the glass negatives, and then we need to undo it. Marcus looked skeptical, but helped her arrange the materials. What exactly are you thinking? Guillaume's process somehow created a connection between these children and the physical world, specifically to this location, his studio. I think when he died, that connection became permanent, trapping them here. By bringing the negatives back here and developing new prints, I may have strengthened that connection. So what's your plan? Sarah hesitated. I'm not entirely sure, but I think we need to break the connection, either by destroying the negatives or by completing some kind of reversal of Guillaume's process. They spent hours studying the journal, trying to decipher Guillaume's techniques. The most detailed description came from his final entries, where he documented the exact chemical mixture he used to develop the plates and the specific arrangements of the subjects. There's a pattern here, Marcus said, pointing to diagrams Guillaume had drawn. He positioned each child in relation to specific points in the room, almost like ritual placement. Sarah looked around her apartment, mentally overlaying Guillaume's studio layout. The mirror, she said suddenly. It always faces the subject. I think it's part of the process, a reflection that somehow captures or contains the spirit. As if in response to her words, a cold breeze swept through the apartment, though all windows were closed. The pages of the journal fluttered, and the white cloth rippled across the table. Did you feel that? Sarah whispered. Marcus nodded, his skepticism visibly wavering. What now? Sarah took a deep breath. Now we break the cycle. We need to reverse Guillaume's process, use his chemicals to destroy the images rather than preserve them. Following the journal's formulas in reverse, they created a solution that would effectively erase the images from the glass plates. As they worked, the apartment grew increasingly cold, and the whispers returned. Multiple voices now, young and frightened, growing more audible with each passing minute. Please hurry. He's coming. He knows. Marcus's hands shook as he helped prepare the chemical bath. Who's coming? He asked, addressing the voices directly. The answer came as a sudden banging from inside the storage closet, loud, violent, as if someone were throwing themselves against the door from within. We need to work faster, Sarah urged, carefully placing the first negative into the solution. The glass hissed and bubbled as the chemicals began to eat away at the emulsion. The banging intensified, the closet door shuddering in its frame. A deep voice, nothing like the children's whispers, roared from behind it. They are mine! Guillaume? Sarah breathed, recognizing the voice from her dream. As each negative dissolved in the chemical bath, the apartment filled with sounds, children crying, Guillaume shouting, furniture scraping across floors that weren't there. The air thickened, making it difficult to breathe. The final negative, the one of the girl beside the coffin, the first Sarah had discovered, seemed to resist the solution, the image fading more slowly than the others. The closet door splintered, a crack appearing down its center. It's not working fast enough, Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. Sarah made a split-second decision. She lifted the partially dissolved negative from the solution and carried it to the closet, standing before the cracking door. You kept them here, she said loudly, addressing Guillaume. You bound them to these images, to this place, but it ends now. With deliberate force, she smashed the glass negative against the door. It shattered, the remaining fragments of the image disintegrating into dust. A howl of rage erupted from behind the door, followed by an explosion of cold air that knocked both Sarah and Marcus to the floor. The apartment plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the street lamps outside the windows. Then, gradually, a different kind of light appeared, soft, warm, emanating from the broken closet door. Through the crack, Sarah could see not the storage space beyond, but a golden radiance in which small figures moved. The children's voices came again, but different now, lighter, happier, receding. Thank you. Going home now. Goodbye. The light grew brighter, then suddenly collapsed in on itself, vanishing with a soft implosion of air. The closet door swung open, revealing nothing but the ordinary storage space and the covered mirror within. Sarah and Marcus sat on the floor in stunned silence for several minutes. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice hoarse. "Did we just exercise your apartment?" Sarah let out a slightly hysterical laugh. "I think we just solved a 166-year-old case of trapped spirits." She looked at the shattered remnants of the negative on the floor. "Guillaume used his photography to bind those children to him, maybe accidentally at first, but then deliberately as he realized what he could do. And when he died, they were trapped here, unable to move on." Marcus finished. "Until we broke the connection by destroying the images that held them." They cleaned up in silence, gathering the shattered glass and chemical-soaked cloths. The apartment felt different now, lighter, as if a heaviness had been lifted from the air itself. "What do we tell the Historical Society?" Marcus asked, as he helped Sarah dispose of the last of the ruined negatives. Sarah considered this. "The truth, but not all of it. We'll say the negatives were damaged by moisture and chemical degradation. It happens often enough with old photographic materials. And the journal? We'll preserve it. It's an important historical record, even if we keep our interpretations to ourselves." She paused. "I don't think anyone would believe us anyway." After Marcus left, promising to return in the morning to help with the formal report, Sarah found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. The night's events kept replaying in her mind. The voices, the light, the sense of release as the children finally moved on. She wandered into the living room and approached the storage closet, which now stood open, revealing ordinary shelves and the sheet-covered mirror. With cautious hands, she pulled the sheet away, revealing the ornate Victorian glass. Her reflection stared back at her, tired, disheveled, but alone. No figures lurked in the background, no faces peered from the shadows. Just her apartment, now seemingly ordinary once more. As dawn broke over New Orleans, casting golden light through her windows, Sarah finally felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever Thomas Guillaume had done in this space, whatever doorway he had opened between worlds, it was now firmly closed. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, searching for Guillaume's tomb. The autumn air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue above the white stone monuments and family crypts. Marcus walked beside her, consulting a map of the cemetery. "It should be in this section according to the records." They found it near the western wall, a simple tomb with weathered stone, the name Guillaume barely legible after more than a century and a half of New Orleans humidity and storms. Sarah placed a small bunch of white flowers at the base of the tomb, not out of respect for the photographer, but for the children whose spirits he had inadvertently or deliberately trapped. "Do you think he knew what he was doing?" Marcus asked quietly. "Or was it an accident? Some combination of chemicals and grief and his own deteriorating mind?" "I think it started as an accident," Sarah replied, studying the tomb. "But from his journal, it seems he began to understand his power over time. The real question is whether he was trying to help the children or possess them." They had spent the past weeks researching deeper into Guillaume's life and work. Records showed he had lost his own family, a wife and young daughter, to yellow fever shortly after arriving in New Orleans. His specialization in photographing deceased children had begun after this personal tragedy. Perhaps he was trying to bring his daughter back, Marcus suggested, or at least hold on to something of the world she belonged to, and instead created a prison for other lost children, Sarah finished. As they turned to leave, Sarah noticed something on the ground near the tomb, a small, weathered daguerreotype case, tarnished with age. She picked it up carefully and opened it. Inside was a portrait of a young girl, perhaps 6 years old, with solemn eyes and a hint of a smile. The image was faded but still clear, a living child, not a post-mortem photograph. Written in faint script at the bottom, Elise Guillaume, 1852, his daughter, The child he had lost. Sarah closed the case gently and placed it back at the base of the tomb, where it had rested for who knew how long. Some connections, she thought, were meant to remain unbroken. "Ready?" Marcus asked, offering his arm. Sarah nodded, taking a final look at Guillot's tomb. "Yes, let's go home." As they walked away through the rows of tombs, a soft breeze stirred the cemetery, rustling the flowers Sarah had left. In the distance, barely audible, the laughter of children playing rose and fell like a wave, then faded into silence. Sarah had changed apartments the week after their encounter with Guillot's spirits. Her new place was in the Bywater neighborhood, in a building constructed in the 1920s with no connection to early photography or Victorian mourning practices. The walls were painted bright colors, the windows large and filled with sunlight. The glass negatives had been officially recorded as lost to deterioration, a common enough occurrence with 19th-century photographic materials that no one questioned the report. Guillot's journal remained in the archive, carefully preserved but no longer accompanied by his haunting images. Sometimes on quiet nights, Sarah would find herself thinking about those children, their faces fixed in perpetual stillness by Guillot's camera, their spirits trapped between worlds for over a century and a half. Had they finally found peace? Had they reunited with the families who had mourned them so desperately that they sought to preserve their images in death? She would never know for certain, but in those moments she liked to imagine them free, running and playing in some golden place beyond the boundaries of glass plates and silver nitrate, beyond the reach of grief and memory, beyond the threshold that separates the living from the dead. And sometimes in her dreams she would hear their whispers one last time, not frightened now, but peaceful, grateful. "Thank you for letting us go." 1 year later, Sarah stood in the main gallery of the Louisiana Historical Society, surveying the exhibition she had curated, Memento Mori, Victorian Death Photography in New Orleans. The walls displayed carefully selected images from the Society's collection, alongside explanatory text about the practice of post-mortem photography and its cultural significance. Conspicuously absent were Thomas Guillot's photographs, though his journal was displayed in a glass case open to a page of technical notes about chemical processes. "Quite a turnout," Marcus commented, joining her with 2 glasses of champagne from the opening reception. Now the Society's head archivist, following the retirement of their predecessor, he had been instrumental in supporting Sarah's exhibition proposal. "More than I expected," Sarah agreed, accepting the glass. "People are fascinated by how previous generations confronted death." Speaking of which, Marcus nodded toward a woman studying the journal display with unusual intensity. Elderly, elegantly dressed in a style that seemed deliberately anachronistic, she had been examining Guillot's journal for nearly 20 minutes. As if sensing their attention, the woman looked up and approached them. "Remarkable exhibition," she said, her accent hinting at old New Orleans. "I'm particularly interested in Thomas Guillot's work. I notice none of his photographs are included. Unfortunately, his glass negatives were too deteriorated for display," Sarah explained carefully. "We only have his journal and written accounts of his techniques." The woman smiled slightly. "A shame. My great-grandmother knew him, you see. She always said his photographs captured something special." Sarah felt a chill despite the warmth of the crowded gallery. Did she mention anything specific about his work? Only that when she looked at his photographs, she sometimes thought she could see the children breathing. The woman's eyes held Sarah's for a long moment, as if they were caught between one world and the next. Before Sarah could respond, the woman thanked them for the exhibition and moved away, disappearing into the crowd of attendees. "That was unsettling," Marcus murmured. Sarah took a long sip of champagne. "Just someone with family stories, that's all." But later, after the reception had ended and the gallery was nearly empty, Sarah noticed something on the floor beneath the display case containing Guillot's journal, a small, yellowed photograph curling at the edges. She picked it up carefully, It showed a Victorian parlour, a coffin draped in black cloth, and beside it, a small girl with unnaturally fixed eyes and rigid posture. The same girl from the negative Sarah had destroyed a year ago. She turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink was a simple message: "Some doorways never fully close." Sarah's hands trembled as she slipped the photograph into her pocket. Outside, the New Orleans night was warm and alive with music, but she felt a familiar coldness seeping into her bones. The chill of a doorway left ajar between worlds, and the whispers of those still caught between.